Hey there guys, Nordic Warrior here, welcome back to my video game review series. So today we're going to be looking at Silent Hill 4 The Room, released in 2004, developed by Konami. So those of you who have been following my channel for a while will probably know that exactly 1 year ago to this day, I reviewed the original Silent Hill for the PS1. Prior to that I also looked at the HD remaster of the second and third games in the series. To sum up my thoughts on the series, I personally think they're some of the most terrifying and enigmatic survival horror games ever made, with the second game being the best in the series in my personal opinion. Long story short, if you're a fan of survival horror games, then you could certainly do a lot worse than the Silent Hill trilogy. With how highly regarded those games are, you would expect the fourth game in the series to expand upon the formula, improving it in some ways and adding some innovation. Unfortunately for me, Silent Hill 4 is a bit of a mixed bag, and it's a game that I have some mixed feelings on. On the one hand, it certainly has plenty of innovation, and it definitely did its bit to try something new, and try to take the series in a new direction. It also had some particular themes that it wanted to present, that it more than delivered on presenting, with the developers having a particular experience in mind that they wanted players to understand, at least thematically. And again, they certainly succeeded in that. Unfortunately, they may have succeeded a little bit too well in that regard. I'll explain what I mean later. Suffice it to say, there are things about this game I liked, but at the same time there are many things about it that I absolutely hated. There were moments where I thought to myself, you know what, this is really interesting, and not necessarily a bad idea. Then there were many times where I wondered, what on earth were the developers thinking when they added this? How could anybody have thought this was a good idea? The game is filled with stuff like that. Interesting ideas, yet baffling design choices that just soured the whole experience and made it so much harder and so much worse than it needed to be. But I digress. I played the game for the first time recently and I figured I would go ahead and give it a review. So just like the rest of the games in the series, the game is a third-person survival horror game, similar in many ways to games such as Resident Evil and Alone in the Dark. The story of the game is a bit of a bizarre one, even when compared to the other games in the series. You play as Henry Townsend, who has found himself locked up inside of his apartment for the past 5 days, with seemingly no means of escape.
What's going on here?
What's strange about this is that despite being locked inside his apartment, the outside world seems at first glance to be functioning as normal. Henry can see the world going by outside his window, people seem normal, traffic seems normal, pretty much everything is as it should be.
Oh man. Hope my luck changes before the party.
Yet for some reason Henry can't communicate with the outside world at all. His phone won't work.
Hello?
Help me.
What? The cord's cut.
And nobody outside the apartment seems to be able to hear him, no matter what he does.
This is the superintendent. Are you in there, Henry?
Help me! There's something wrong with this room! Help! Let me out of here!
Is anybody home?
All Henry seems to be able to do is sleep, and watch the world go by day after day. In addition to this, Henry has been having a string of disturbing nightmares. The game begins by allowing you to explore the apartment in first person, basically acting as a tutorial. There are several curiosities to interact with that do their bit to familiarise you with how this aspect of the game works. Shortly after the initial introduction, Henry discovers a hole in the bathroom wall that leads to the outside world.
Somebody in there?
However, despite entering the outside world, Henry appears to be going in circles and navigating alternate dimensions of sorts, and no matter what he does or where he goes, he still ends up right back to square one, trapped in that apartment. The game is basically split up into two modes. You have the apartment that essentially acts as a hub for the player, allowing you to save game at the only predetermined save point, which differs from previous games in the series where save points could be found during levels. The apartment also allows you to heal, as well as to store infantry items and weapons. More on those later. There are also events that take place during these sections that help to advance the story at certain stages. The second mode consists of the actual levels. These can be accessed by entering the hole in the wall, which changes size as the game's story progresses. These levels are more reminiscent of the previous games, consisting of third-person gameplay with a fixed camera. In these levels you must traverse a twisted, distorted version of the town of Ashfield, as well as various other disturbing locations, defeating enemies, solving puzzles, and generally trying to find out what on earth is going on, as well as finding a way to escape the apartment. As the story progresses, you run into several different characters, most of which appear to be other residents of the apartment building, all of which seem to be completely unaware of the situation and what's going on. Some of them even believe that they're in a dream or something.
Hey, you're the guy that lives across from me.
Yeah, my name's Henry.
I'm Richard Braintree, from 207.
The game has plenty of cutscenes to convey the story, as well as plenty of dialogue. In addition to the dialogue, there's also plenty of reading involved, which further expands the game's plot, and explains a lot of the lore. As far as the overall gameplay goes, as I mentioned before, it's very similar to the previous games of the series, and there's plenty of familiarity, though there are some noteworthy changes, most of which were not for the better in my personal opinion. Believe me, I'll get to that. Just like the previous games, you have a fixed camera, which depending on your point of view can help or hinder the experience, but I'd argue that it certainly does its bit to make the game more scary. One issue I have with the game, however, is the controls. With this being the fourth game in the series, and coming out in 2004, well into the 6th generation of gaming, I would have expected the controls to feel more fluid and a bit more responsive, as well as less janky than previous titles, since by then they were starting to feel a bit dated. Unfortunately, this isn't the case, and the controls of Silent Hill 4 are just as janky as ever. In fact, for some reason I found them even more janky than Silent Hill 3. And given the overall level design, this makes the game consistently frustrating. The game is even filled with narrow hallways, and a lot of the time these are filled with enemies, most of which you're forced to engage with in combat, in order to progress in the game. And the slow, clunky, unresponsive and janky controls are on really focused display here. The original game as well as the two sequels had plenty of open areas, which emphasised that combat wasn't always the best option, and that running away from enemies was sometimes necessary. But in this game, the level design just feels so linear, to the point where there's only really one way to play the game practically, and it makes the game unfairly difficult at times. For me, the worst thing about the game was the level design, and it's something that greatly hindered the whole experience. In the first 3 games, there was plenty of backtracking, challenging puzzles and confusing objectives, as well as challenging and thrilling combat. But as far as I'm concerned, it never felt unfair, since in those games for the most part, the level design as well as the placement of enemies and weapons always felt justified. I felt as if the difficulty gradually increased over time as it should, as well as my skill as the player, making for a balanced experience. This made the game fun to play while maintaining its experience. As the games progressed, you took on tougher enemies, more hazards in the environment and more challenging puzzles, but as you gained more powerful weapons and gradually increased your skill, it actually made the game way more fun, and you wanted to see it through to the end. Unfortunately for me, Silent Hill 4 doesn't really have that quality. The game is excruciatingly hard on a first playthrough. And not just because of the combat, but the level design in general. As I mentioned before, previous games were challenging, but never felt unfair. You, at least for the most part, had some indication, however small, of where you were supposed to go, or what you were supposed to do. In this game, however, most of the time you don't have this. You will have no idea whatsoever what your objective is, what the premise of any of the game's puzzles are, and what on earth you're supposed to be doing. Seriously, I was able to complete Silent Hill 3, which is known for its brutal difficulty, multiple times and even on hard mode. Yet in this game, I found myself running around like a blue-arse fly for most of the game, backtracking through the same linear locations, over and over again, defeating the same enemies, and generally being confused and befuddled at what on earth was going on. For the most part, the game gives you nothing to go on, and just wastes your time, as well as confuses you constantly, making it a complete chore to play at times. I mentioned before how the game basically forces you to engage in combat. Enemy will come out of walls and attack you, leaving you almost no way to defend yourself, and will often be placed in the most inconvenient and frustrating locations, forcing you to fight them to progress. And this would be fine if the game's combat was fun, or if there was at least always a way to defeat enemies, but that isn't the case here, because in addition to the slow, clunky and flat out unresponsive controls, certain enemies in the game can't even be damaged or defeated. Yeah, I'm not joking, a sizable amount of the enemies in this game are literally invincible and can't be defeated. Some enemies, such as ghosts, will even damage you with their very presence, making even trying to engage with them at all feel like a complete waste of time, since you're only going to take damage and end up using up all your items. Yeah, I know there's an item called a Sword of Obedience, which is sadly nowhere near as cool as it sounds, that can permanently incapacitate ghosts. Keeping them in one place until you, if ever, choose to reacquire it. But these items are so few and far between that it barely even makes a difference. So to sum up, the combat in the game, it basically sucks. It just isn't fun, not even a little bit. Speaking of combat, let's talk about another major issue with the game, the weapons. As I mentioned, in previous Silent Hill games you would start off with some crappy melee weapon, such as a pocket knife or a metal pipe, and as you progress in the game you would be able to find more powerful and effective melee weapons that would serve you well in combat. On subsequent playthroughs you would be able to acquire even more powerful and sometimes even wacky weapons that make the game a bit of a power fantasy. In this game, every single weapon on a first playthrough, and I mean every single weapon, flat out sucks. You basically get a pipe early in the game, and yeah, that's basically all you need. All the other melee weapons in the game, aside from the axe, which seemed to work well enough, and I chose to use that for the majority of the game, basically suck even worse than the pipe. The weapons you get later on are either far too slow to be practically used in combat, because enemies move way faster than you do, and speed is the key to beating them, or they have weapon durability, and will break after only a few uses, with them not even doing that much damage anyway. Such as the many pointless golf clubs you can find during the game. Seriously, don't even bother with them. There is basically no progression whatsoever in terms of the game's melee weapons. As far as the guns go, again, don't even bother with them. Guns are completely useless in this game. Just stick with the crappy melee weapons. On a first playthrough you get two guns, a pistol and a revolver. The pistol is worse than useless, since it can sometimes take a full clip of ammo to bring down a basic enemy, and you'll find yourself wasting so much ammo. As for the revolver, it's considerably more powerful than the pistol for sure, but the problem is, good luck finding more than a few boxes of ammo for it throughout the game. You're not going to have enough ammo to use it consistently, only the pistol can be used a lot. There are also silver bullets that can be loaded into it that allows you to damage ghosts, incapacitating them for a short while, allowing you to escape or use the Sword of Obedience on them. But again, these are so few and far between that they're barely even worth mentioning. The game even teases you at one point with guns that would be more powerful, yet it turns out they're only replicas and you can't use them. This pissed me off so much that it almost made me want to rage quit. So yeah, compared to the previous games in the series, the combat and the weapons suck. Yeah, I know you can get a submachine gun on a second playthrough, but I didn't really have the urge to play through the game again after beating it, but I digress. Another extremely frustrating aspect to the game is the fact that they added an encumbrance system this time. Basically, you can only carry a small number of items in the game, and this accounts for everything, including weapons, ammo, which even adds insult to injury by forcing you to carry cases of ammo in separate inventory slots. Quest items, healing items such as health drinks and med packs, all carried separately. Even items that are necessary for advancing the story take up an inventory slot, and there are sometimes multiple of these at the same time. This means you will be constantly, and I mean constantly, returning to the apartment for several reasons. First of all, to heal your character, since carrying health items just isn't practical, making them basically useless, as well as to save game. Why they couldn't have just added a manual save to the pause menu is beyond me, as well as having to constantly go back and forth to swap items from your trunk. This gets so frustrating after a while, and it makes the game an absolute chore to play past a certain point. There are even sections of the game that have the apartment implemented into the puzzle solving mechanics, meaning you will be constantly going in and out of it, wasting so much time doing so. If you want to carry more than one weapon, you can't because you're going to need the inventory slots. Why would they add this feature only to make the game more tedious and more frustrating? To make this even worse, at a certain point in the game, you get a companion, your neighbour Eileen, who follows you around for the final act of the game, and even helps you out in combat.
Anyway, the only way out of here is through that hole.
Okay, take me with you.
That sounds cool, right? Well, unfortunately it's a pain in the ass. Eileen, while somewhat competent in combat, and more than capable of defending herself here and there, only gets in your way most of the time due to the terrible AI. And the game basically turns into one massive escort mission, where you have to protect her and make sure she keeps up with you. To add insult to injury, Eileen also has her own weapons that can be found and acquired during the game, some of them hidden in obscure locations. And these, for some reason, despite being carried by Eileen, still take up a slot in your inventory. I mean seriously, Konami were taking the piss when they added this. They had to have been, I mean come on man. They had to be trolling the player and just doing this for the sake of tedium. There are so many things like that in the game that are seriously frustrating and needlessly tedious. Another annoying addition to the game is that at a certain point, they make returning to the apartment not only boring and tedious, but hazardous and nerve-wracking. For most of the game up until this point, you've been relying on the apartment, using it for healing and storing items. Well, at a certain point, the apartment no longer heals you, and instead deals you damage at an alarming rate, meaning that you now have no choice but to carry and store health items that, as we mentioned before, are impractical to carry.
I'm always.
Basically, the apartment starts to get haunted, and the walls start attacking you. Since this happens in first person, there's no way to combat this, and no way to predict it. And the controls and movement while in first person feels like it's in slow motion, even slower than the regular levels. There are items that can help ward off these attacks in the apartment, and help to make it safer, such as holy candles that you can light to sanctify certain points. But in my experience, these don't seem to work, and it's very unclear where the hitboxes are for placing these. And once you place a candle, you can't move it, making this feature feel quite pointless. It's just an aspect of the game that feels tacked on and unfinished, and for me, it does its bit to sour the experience. So the overall gameplay and level design is extremely flawed, and as far as the story goes, and the overall narrative, as I mentioned before, it gets revealed to you as you play the game, and you get bits and pieces of information here and there. Things seem to happen in the alternate dimensions that foreshadow things that happen in the game's real world. For example, Henry will witness characters die before hearing on the radio that they died for real. This is very confusing at first, but it begins to make more sense the longer you play, and the more information you get.
Hurry up and get that ambulance.
Quit yapping and move her already.
One of the things that you'll find yourself doing for I'd say about 40% of the game or so is spying on your neighbours, trying to look for any sign that they acknowledge you or do something to advance the story. Throughout the game you also learn about a mysterious character named Walter Sullivan, who was a notorious serial killer believed to be dead. I don't want to spoil the story here because it is actually quite interesting and enigmatic. Suffice it to say, it's one of the game's strongest attributes. Unfortunately though, the game's endings are a little bit anticlimactic in my opinion. You get 4 different endings depending on how you play the game. You also get a final boss battle at the end, which is pretty easy when you know what to do, but it's relatively interesting nonetheless, and it's something different to the rest of the game. So needless to say, this game is flawed, and I mean really flawed. So much so that I found it a bit of a chore to play at times, and I can honestly not be bothered playing through it again anytime soon. Here's the thing though, despite everything that went wrong about the game, and despite all the design flaws and tedium, there's something about the game that I do appreciate, and that is that, as I mentioned before, thematically it works in the way that it was supposed to. Let me do my best to try to explain this. So the developers of the game clearly wanted it to be an allegory for depression or loneliness, and from very early on in the game, the apartment, which as I mentioned before is your main hub, is established to be a safe space of sorts. With your character being in first person, it's a deliberate choice. You really do feel trapped in that apartment, watching the world go on without you, oblivious to your very existence. Your neighbours live all around you, and in the case of Eileen right next to you, she's right there, yet you can't communicate with or interact with her at all, and the same goes for the rest of your neighbours. It's like you want to leave the apartment and participate in life, yet you just won't let yourself. You get too comfortable in your safe space, seeing the outside world as scary and unpredictable. Every time you try to leave and do something new, you end up right back where you started. It's like you're trapped in your own mind, set in your ways. The game does a perfect job of portraying this theme, and it has a certain maddening quality about it. As the story progresses, the apartment will start to change. Subtle changes that emphasise the deterioration of Henry and his situation. The relationship with Eileen is quite interesting too, since she is vital to the game's ending, depending on how you treat her, and she in some ways represents a better future for Henry. He spends so much time watching her from the apartment, but never interacts with her until the events of the game. This game, as frustrating as it is, also succeeds in being scary. This game is absolutely terrifying. In fact, this may actually be the scariest game I've ever played, and I've played a lot of horror games. Seriously, there isn't a single moment when playing this game when you're not on edge. The apartment is eerie and plays on your natural claustrophobia, as well as your fear of being alone and being unprotected and unguarded. And the levels themselves are hazardous and nerve-wracking. In short, the game genuinely makes you feel scared, and it's as atmospheric as any horror game I've ever played. Also, the enemy designs here are extremely disturbing and extremely terrifying. Seriously, I mean, look at them. They give me chills just looking at them, but I digress. The frustrating aspects of the game, as annoying as they are, could be considered necessary considering the themes. An argument could be made that they were intended to be this way to enhance the experience and the overall depression theme, and if that is the case then the game certainly succeeded. But sadly, whatever way you want to rationalise it, the game just isn't fun to play in my personal opinion, making it a frustrating nightmare. Another issue with the game I thought I'd mention, and this isn't really a major issue, it's just something I thought I'd bring up. I was playing through the game on my Xbox 360, since it's backwards compatible with it, and when doing this, for some reason the character models in the cutscenes were all glitchy, as you can clearly see from the footage. Again, this is due to the backwards compatibility and not really the game itself, but I just thought it would be funny to point out, but I digress.
This is my dream and you don't even know my name. It's Cynthia.
Your dream.
So yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about Silent Hill 4 The Room. It's an interesting game for sure. It's hard for me to really rate a game like this. If I were rating it purely on its visual aesthetics, sound design and atmosphere, it would score quite highly for a survival horror game. But unfortunately the gameplay and level design just sucks in my personal opinion. So yeah, as thematic and atmospheric as the game is, I have to take the gameplay into consideration and give the game a disappointing but earned 3 out of 10. It's not the worst game I've ever played, but it's certainly one of the most disappointing. Thanks for watching guys. As flawed as this game is, I still enjoyed checking it out and reviewing it. Let me know what you guys think. Stay tuned for more retrospective video game reviews. Once again, I have a lot of reviews coming to the channel in the near future. Thanks for watching and God bless.